We return to the United Nations headquarters. Let's listen to the statements of the Syrian representative.
Various challenges, foremost being the outbreak of devastating conflicts in many regions around the world, the continued occupation of some peoples of the world, the spread of the scourge of terrorism, declining rates of development, and a sharp rise in the rates of poverty and hunger, in addition to the catastrophic impacts of the unilateral coercive measures. That, in addition to the economic blockade policies and the negative repercussions of climate change and its related natural disasters. Confronting all these challenges is an urgent need for us all, as they reflect on the future of the generations to come. Eliminating them or mitigating their impact to a minimum requires global cooperation among member states. It also requires solidarity and concerted effort to build a new multipolar world order that achieves a new balance in international relations, including through reforming international institutions and other institutions, foremost the Security Council. It also requires true sustainable development that guarantees the benefit and well-being of all peoples of the world. Mr. President, the policies of creative chaos adopted by successive American administrations in our region to serve their geopolitical and selfish interests have led to destabilization and insecurity. They work to create and exaggerate problems to ignite tension, thereby resulting in conflicts. They spent billions of dollars to demolish and destroy development achievements made over decades. They contributed to the emergence of the phenomenon of extremism and terrorism, such as the terrorist organizations ISIL and Al-Nusra Front. Multilateralism, the United Nations Charter, and other relevant international agreements were not spared from this creative American chaos. Over the past 10 years, we have witnessed an increasing tendency to misinterpret and misapply the provisions of the Charter, especially Article 51 thereof. They were used as an excuse to justify attacks against the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of other countries. They manipulated the provisions of international conventions and treaties and politicized human rights issues to justify interfering in the internal affairs of other countries and bringing pressure to bear on them. Mr. President, the basic principle affirmed by the Charter of the United Nations is the respect of sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of member states. Thus, any acquisition of land of others by force is an occupation. Any illegal military presence on the territory of a sovereign state is a clear violation of this charter and a plain breach of international law. It must end immediately without preconditions or limitations. Accordingly, Israel's occupation of the Arab lands in Palestine and the Syrian Golan since 1967 until this very day, and the resulting and consequent construction of settlement, change of the demographic composition, institutional structure, especially through attempts to forcefully impose the Israeli citizenship on the people of the Golan, not to mention the plundering of the natural resources of the Golan, the seizure of Syrian farmers' lands to build huge wind turbines, and other documented violations, all of the above represent the most heinous forms of grave and systematic violations of the UN Charter and of international humanitarian law. The Syrian Arab Republic reaffirms its legitimate right to restore the entire occupied Syrian Golan up to the line of June 4, 1967, no matter how long it takes. It is an inalienable right that is not subject to to compromise or pressure and is not subject to the statute of limitations. It is guaranteed by international law and relevant UN resolutions, especially Security Council Resolution number 497 of the year 1981. Syria also stresses that it will exercise its legitimate right to defend its land and people by all necessary means, and to ensure that the Israeli occupation authorities are held accountable for all their crimes with no impunity. Mr. President, Syria has and remains a supporter of the Palestinian cause, as it is the Central Arab cause. Syria has spared no effort to stand alongside the brotherly Palestinian people in their legitimate struggle to regain their legitimate rights, especially their right to establish their independent statehood on their land with Jerusalem as its capital, and to grant Palestine full membership in the United Nations. What we have witnessed this year of dangerous escalation of Israeli criminal practices, in which the number of victims has reached its highest level, is pushing the region to unprecedented levels of tension and instability. This is exemplified in committing more massacres, escalation of its military aggression, and its repeated missile bombing of Syrian cities, ports, and civil airports. This has endangered civilian lives and the safety of civil aviation. It has also hampered UN humanitarian operations. Moreover, it has continued its policies of settlement, Judaization, siege, arbitrary arrest, forced displacement, and racial discrimination in the occupied Arab territories. While the Syrian Arab Republic condemns in the strongest terms all these Israeli crimes and attacks, it equally denounces the continued support for such practices, or the silence of some countries that proclaim themselves protectors of international humanitarian law and human rights law. This makes them complicit with the perpetrators of these crimes. It clearly demonstrates their double standards. Mr. President, the continued Israeli occupation of Arab lands and its brutal practices are consistent with the destructive role played by some countries on Syrian lands. The United States and Turkey continue to violate Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity by insisting on their continued presence, illegal military presence on Syrian lands, and supporting separatist militias and terrorist organizations. This is in addition to the visits by Western political and military officials and others to Syrian territory, by infiltrating Syrian territory without any respect for Syria's sovereignty and independence. This is considered a flagrant interference in its internal affairs. The systematic and exposed American plunder of the Syrian people's national wealth, such as oil, gas, and wheat, has deprived the Syrians of their resources. It has exacerbated their humanitarian suffering in an unprecedented manner. Our latest statistics show that the total value of direct and indirect losses caused to the oil sector in Syria has exceeded 115 billion US dollars. We believe that the United Nations is obligated to hold the United States accountable and ask it to return this looted money to the Syrian government. In parallel, the United States of America and its European allies continue to impose unilateral coercive measures that are illegal, immoral, and inhumane on various sectors in Syria. This has only contributed to exacerbate the suffering of Syrians wherever they are, given the fact that their impact includes third countries. The Secretary General has noted in his reports the impact of these measures on UN procurement and payments. These countries intentionally include in their measures the public health sector, the banking sector, the air transport sector, the Syrian civil aviation equipment, and the energy sector. It also includes banning the supply of oil and its derivatives to Syria, or the import of power plants, equipment related to power generation, or spare parts. They also include bans on importing equipment and machinery necessary for drinking water supply, irrigation, water sterilization and purification, and repair and improvement of the sewage system. The agricultural sector was not spared from these unilateral sanctions, as they included preventing the import of fertilizers and machinery necessary for agricultural production that provides food for the Syrians. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Syria was one of the most stable and prosperous countries in the world. It was achieving food self-sufficiency and providing all the basic necessities of life for its people in a way that was rarely seen in the region. However, the terrorist war launched against Syria since 2011 altered the situation. It caused a humanitarian crisis that was very significant. The severity was aggravated by the imposition of unilateral coercive measures. Recently, the devastating earthquake that struck Syria on February the 6th of this year added a new burden and more suffering. The earthquake destroyed hundreds of buildings, infrastructure and service facilities. It caused thousands of victims and injuries and made tens of thousands homeless. The Syrian government has been keen to take all measures to facilitate the arrival of humanitarian aid and relief workers to all affected areas. It has granted and still grants open approvals to the UN and international organizations working in Syria to facilitate and accelerate the entry of emergency relief supplies to support the affected. It also opened, by a sovereign decision, a border crossing to facilitate the humanitarian response in the affected areas under the control of terrorist organizations in northwestern Syria. In this regard, the Syrian Arab Republic renews its thanks and appreciation to all countries that stood in solidarity with Syria and its people, all those who have rushed to respond to the needs of the Syrian people in light of the difficult circumstances they faced. It also expresses its appreciation to the Secretary General of the United Nations for launching the flash appeal to respond to the catastrophic repercussions of the earthquake. The Syrian government is still continuing, within its limited capabilities, to make every effort to address the impact of the earthquake in all 4 affected governorates. Last May, the President of the Republic issued a decree establishing the National Fund to support those affected by the earthquake, with the aim of providing them financial support and helping them overcome the resulting physical, material, or psychological harm. This decree represented the foundation of the basic directions and the National Action Plan approved by the Syrian government to address the repercussions of the earthquake from various aspects. And this to move from the emergency response phase of delivering relief work to the recovery phase. The Syrian Arab Republic reiterates that improving the humanitarian situation in Syria requires providing sustainable solutions to support the Syrians, especially after the earthquake. It requires increasing the size and quantity of early recovery projects in a way that reduces dependency on life-saving humanitarian aid and increases the Syrians' resilience. It would also help provide conditions for a dignified and voluntary return of displaced persons and refugees to their origins. However, this requires providing the necessary funding through international donors, fulfilling the pledges they have made. Mr. President, turning to the return of refugees, Syria declares before this international organization from this podium its readiness to welcome the return of every Syrian refugee who left their home, village, or city. We call upon our citizens who were forced by terrorist organizations to seek refuge to return to their homeland. The Syrian government has taken all necessary decisions in this field. We are cooperating with the High Commissioner for Refugees and the Arab Contact Committee to reach this noble goal. In this regard, I call upon Western countries that ask refugees not to return to their homeland to stop these inhumane practices. In parallel, Syria responded positively to the efforts and initiatives presented within the framework of the political track. It supported the approach of local settlement and national reconciliation as a way to restore conditions to normalcy all over the country. This would also strengthen national unity and the cohesion of the Syrian society. It has participated in the meetings held in the Astana format. It welcomed its results and maintained communication with the Special Envoy to Syria. Mr. President, the Arab Summit held in May in Jeddah, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, has made a great achievement. It restored to the collective Arab position its shine, and to the Arab joint action its momentum. During that summit, the Arab countries affirmed their support for Syria in preserving its sovereignty and territorial integrity to overcome the difficult circumstances it's going through as a result of the terrorist war launched against it and the economic sanctions imposed upon it, in addition to the repercussions of the devastating earthquake that struck the country. Syria expresses its support and solidarity with the Libyan people in facing the repercussions of the hurricane and floods that struck the country, as well as the Moroccan people due to the devastating earthquake. Syria reaffirms its support for the right of the Russian Federation to defend itself and protect its national security in response to aggressive Western policies. In doing so, they are not only defending themselves, but also the rights of all of us to reject the logic of Western and unipolar hegemony. Syria commends the constructive and responsible approach of the Islamic Republic of Iran to return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action from which the USA has unilaterally and illegally withdrew. It calls upon the United States and its Western allies to meet Iran's legitimate demands. Syria supports the One China principle. It supports the positions of the People's Republic of China in confronting attempts at external interference in its internal affairs, whether in Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Xinjiang. It stresses China's inalienable right to take whatever measures and steps it decides to defend its sovereignty, especially to counter the unprecedented escalation and provocation policy practiced by the USA against it. Syria condemns the unjust economic blockade imposed on Cuba for decades, including the U.S. administration's extension of the so-called trading with the enemy law. Syria calls for an end to the military action and exercises conducted by the United States on the Korean Peninsula, which lead to escalation of tension in this region. Syria also demands the lifting of all forms of unilateral coercive measures imposed by Western countries on the Russian Federation, Iran, Venezuela, Belarus, Nicaragua, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, and against my country, Syria. It considers them economic terrorism no less brutal or dangerous than armed terrorism, especially in terms of its catastrophic humanitarian effect on the targeted peoples. To conclude, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the platform of the United Nations General Assembly was created to be a platform for dialogue and public diplomacy among member states, and not a platform for leveling false accusations or launching hostile campaigns against each other. That is why we look forward to the current session of the General Assembly. Under your leadership, Mr. Francis, we look forward to it being able to fulfill the slogan you raised, that is, rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity, accelerating action on the 2030 agenda, and its sustainable development goals towards peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability for all. This can be achieved by working to translate it into real and serious action that contributes to giving all countries fair opportunities that ensure no one is left behind. It would also consolidate the position and status of the General Assembly as the most representative body in the United Nations. Thank you, Mr. President.